35 years ago, I slept on a park bench, shivering in the middle of winter. My stomach was empty, my pockets held nothing but lint, and my family pretended I didn't exist. Today, my grandson calls me his hero. But when he launched his book about me, I didn't show up. Instead, I mailed him the most painful piece of myself. That's how I'd like to begin this story, because if you only knew me now, you'd never imagine where I came from. You'd see a man with a roof over his head, gray hair neatly combed back, and steady hands that have built hundreds of homes. You'd see the proud grandfather of a boy named Ethan Grant, a kid with a bright smile and a gift for words. But the man you see today, me, Samuel Grant, was once nothing more than a shadow. When I lost everything, people I thought would stand by me turned away. My mother, Helen, the woman who raised me to believe that family was everything, crossed the street when she saw me. My brother, Mark, a successful banker, told anyone who asked that I was no longer part of the family. And my wife, Linda, quietly packed a bag, took our teenage son, David, and whispered as she left, "I can't do this anymore, Sam." If you'd seen me then, you wouldn't have called me a father, a husband, or even a son. I was invisible, and I began to believe maybe I deserved it. But Ethan, my grandson, wasn't alive back then. He only knows the man I became after the fall, not the broken figure I was. This year, he did something that shook me to my core. He wrote a book. The title was "My Hero is My Grandfather." His words painted me as a warrior, a builder, a man of impossible resilience, and while every page filled me with pride, it also tore me open, because he didn't know the whole story. So, when the family gathered for his book launch, Mark, David, even Linda, I stayed home. Instead, I took out the most personal thing I own, the journal I began writing 35 years ago when I was homeless and abandoned. I slipped it into a package and mailed it to Ethan. No fanfare, no speech at the launch, just a quiet gift, carrying the truth of a man who nearly disappeared. Now let me tell you why. When you hit rock bottom, you learn something about silence. Silence becomes heavier than words. Back in those days, no one asked where I slept, or if I had eaten, or if I was still breathing. And when your own family treats you like you don't exist, silence starts to swallow you whole. That journal, those crumpled, coffee-stained pages, was the only place my voice still mattered. I wrote about the cold that seeped into my bones. I wrote about the shame of watching people I knew hurry past me, avoiding eye contact. I wrote about the ache of missing my son's birthdays. And yet, between the despair, I also wrote about sparks of hope. The day I earned my first $20 doing day labor, the taste of hot soup from a church kitchen, the moment I decided I wasn't done fighting for my life. That journal was my witness. And when Ethan called me his hero, I realized he only knew the rebuilt version of me, not the shattered one. A hero without scars is just a fairy tale. I didn't want him to look at me like a myth. I wanted him to know that courage doesn't mean you never fall. It means you fall so hard you think you'll never get up, and then you do anyway, brick by brick. So why didn't I go to the launch? Because standing there, smiling for the cameras, letting my family clap and cheer, would have been a lie. It would have erased the truth of those years on the street. It would have turned my story into a neat little success tale. And I'm not neat, I'm not polished. My story is jagged, raw, and stitched together with pain. I wanted Ethan to see me for who I really was, not just his hero, but a flawed, broken man who clawed his way back. That's why I mailed him my journal. That's why I'm telling you this story now. And so the hook of this story isn't just about triumph. It's about betrayal, survival, and legacy. It's about a man who was erased, who built himself back piece by piece, and who now dares to show his grandson the scars behind the smile. Stay with me, because what happened in those 35 years will make you question everything you think you know about family, failure, and redemption. If you were to walk into my home today, you'd see something simple. A small house tucked at the end of a quiet street, nothing grand, but every corner has been shaped by my own two hands. The floorboards creak, the walls carry the smell of old wood and fresh paint, and on the shelves are photographs, some framed, some bent with age. When people see me now, they think of me as steady, a man who has weathered storms, who came out the other side with grit and dignity. What most don't realize is that this peace, this quiet, was built on years of noise, arguments, slammed doors, words I can't forget. Before I lost everything, my life looked so different. Back then, I was Samuel Grant, the man who owned a small but growing construction business in St. Louis. My days started early, before sunrise, with a cup of strong coffee and a set of blueprints spread across my kitchen table. I had calloused hands, a sunburned neck, and a sense of pride that came from seeing a house stand where, days before, there had been nothing but dirt. I wasn't rich, not by any stretch, but I was building something, for my wife, Linda, for our teenage son, David, and for the future. I believed, maybe too strongly, that if you worked hard enough, everything else would fall into place. Family mattered to me, or at least I thought it did. My mother, Helen, had raised me to believe appearances were everything. She was a sharp woman, the kind who dressed for the grocery store as if it were church. She'd tell me, "Samuel, a Grant man never lets himself look weak, remember that." I took those words to heart. Maybe too much. My older brother, Mark, worked at a bank downtown. He wore pressed suits, spoke in numbers and forecasts, and always reminded me that my business wasn't real success. "You're just swinging hammers, Sam," he'd say with a smirk. I'd laugh it off, but his words always stuck. He lived in a world of spreadsheets, while I lived in one of bricks and beams. And then there was Linda. My wife was gentle but pragmatic. She loved me. I knew she did, but she was the kind of woman who needed stability like she needed air. She worried constantly about money, about bills, about whether David would have the life she dreamed for him. I used to hold her hands and say, "Trust me, Lynn, I'll get us there. Just give me time." And for a while, she did. David, our boy, was 15 then. He was quiet, a little awkward, more comfortable with books than with people. I saw myself in him, the way he observed the world, the way he wanted to stay in the background. We didn't talk much, not about feelings anyway, but I thought he trusted me. I thought he looked at me and saw someone solid, someone unshakable. If you'd asked me then, I would have told you my life was far from perfect, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. I had my business, my family, my place in the community. Neighbors came to me for help fixing roofs or repairing fences. On Sundays, I sat with my mother in church, shook hands with old classmates, and believed I was living the life a man should. I didn't know how fragile it all was. I didn't see the cracks forming in my business when I took out loans I shouldn't have. I didn't notice Linda's growing silence at the dinner table, her eyes scanning bills instead of meeting mine. I didn't realize how far I'd drifted from David, who spent more and more time in his room, headphones on, retreating into his own world. At that time, I thought I was strong. I thought I was the kind of man who could carry the weight of everything, business, family, pride, on his shoulders alone. Looking back, I can see how blind I was. Blind to how much I relied on the fragile approval of others. Blind to how quickly a life can unravel when you believe it's unshakable. But I'll never forget the feeling of those days before it all collapsed. I remember standing in the doorway of a house I had just finished, sunlight pouring through new windows, dust still in the air, and thinking, "This is it. This is proof that I've made something lasting." What I didn't know then was that within a year, that same pride would turn to ashes. What I thought was lasting would vanish, and the people I believed would never turn their backs, my own blood, would look right through me as if I were already gone. But in that moment, before the storm hit, I was still Samuel Grant, the builder, the father, the husband, a man who believed his life had roots too deep to ever be pulled out. I used to think hard work could outbuild bad luck. I believed if I pushed harder, worked longer hours, took on more jobs, everything would work out. But life doesn't always pay you in sweat. Sometimes it punishes you for believing too much in yourself. It started small. A job ran over budget. A client delayed payment. I told myself it was temporary. "We'll catch up next month," I'd reassure Linda, sliding bills into a drawer. But then the market shifted. Material costs went up, new contracts dried up, and suddenly I was juggling overdue loans. Mark, my brother, had warned me once over coffee. "Sam, you're spreading yourself too thin. This is why men like me stick to numbers, not nails." He said it with that smug grin of his. I remember laughing it off. But late at night, staring at my accounts, his words echoed like a curse. The bank started calling. Deadlines became threats. And then came the day I'll never forget. The day the foreclosure notice arrived. I sat at the kitchen table with the paper trembling in my hands. Linda stood across from me, arms folded, her face pale. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just said softly, "I can't do this anymore, Sam." Then she turned, walked into the bedroom, and I heard the zipper of a suitcase. I followed her, desperate. "Linda, please, we can fix this. I'll find more work. She cut me off. "David needs stability. He needs food, a home, a future. You can't give him that right now. I have to." I wanted to argue, to fight for us, but deep down I knew she was right. So I stood there, silent, as she packed our son's clothes. David didn't even look at me when he walked past with his backpack slung over his shoulder. He was 15, and I had already failed him. When the door closed behind them, the silence that filled the house was suffocating. Within weeks, the business collapsed completely. My tools were repossessed, my truck taken, the house locked. I went from being a man with responsibilities to a man with nothing but the clothes on his back. At first, I tried reaching out. I called my mother. She didn't pick up. When I showed up at her door, she cracked it open just enough to say, "Samuel, you've embarrassed us. You need to get yourself together before you come around here again." And then the door shut. Mark was worse. He didn't even pretend to care. When I asked if he could help me with a loan, just enough to get back on my feet, he leaned back in his office chair, smoothed his tie, and said, "Sam, I warned you. You made your choices. You'll have to live with them." That was the day I realized I wasn't just broke. I was erased. Nights blurred together. I slept on benches, under bridges, sometimes in shelters when there was space. The cold was unbearable, but the hunger was worse. Nothing cuts deeper than staring at scraps in a trash bin and realizing that's your dinner. The hardest part wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was the shame. Seeing people I used to know, neighbors, old clients, cross the street to avoid me, pretending they didn't recognize me. And worst of all, the look in David's eyes the last time I saw him. Disappointment mixed with something worse. Pity. I became invisible. And when the world stops seeing you, you start to question whether you're really there at all. One night, sitting against the side of a convenience store, I overheard two men walking by. One said to the other, "That guy used to own a business. Now look at him." They didn't think I could hear them, but I did. And it burned. I started to believe maybe my family was right. Maybe I deserved this. Maybe I wasn't a man anymore. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not a single moment. It's a series of moments, each one carving away a little more of your dignity. The eviction notice, the door shutting in your face, the empty look in your child's eyes, the sound of your own stomach growling in the dark. That was my conflict. Not just losing my home, my business, my family, but losing myself. And the question that haunted me every single night was this: if even your own blood turns away, what's left to fight for? Rock bottom isn't one single night. It's a long stretch of them. Cold sidewalks, empty stomach, the smell of damp concrete, and the weight of shame pressing on your chest. I had gotten used to it. almost resigned myself to the idea that this was who I was now. A failure, a ghost, a man who had been forgotten by everyone who once called him family. But then came the night that changed everything. I was sitting behind a diner, my back against a dumpster, waiting for the staff to throw out scraps at closing. My head was pounding, my throat dry. That's when I saw it. Half buried in a pile of trash, a small, beaten-up notebook. Its cover was torn, the edges curled, but the pages inside were blank. I don't know why I picked it up. Maybe because it was the only thing in that moment that looked untouched, unruined. I took it with me, found a pen on the ground nearby, and for the first time in months I wrote. The words weren't profound, just raw. I am hungry, I am cold, I am tired, but I am still here. Something about putting it on paper made me feel less invisible. For the first time in months, my voice existed somewhere, even if no one else would read it. That notebook became my anchor. Every night I filled its pages, anger at my family, regret for my mistakes, prayers I wasn't sure anyone was listening to. But more than anything, I wrote promises. Promises to myself. I will work again, I will eat again, I will stand again. The next morning, I made a choice. I wasn't going to die on a bench. I wasn't going to vanish as the man people whispered about in passing. If no one else believed in me, I would believe in myself, even if only in ink on paper. That day, I walked to a construction site on the edge of town. I asked the foreman if he needed an extra hand. He looked me up and down, saw my ragged clothes, my unshaven face, and said, "You want a day's wage? You work like hell. Otherwise, don't bother." So I worked. Harder than I ever had. My hands bled, my back screamed. But when he handed me 20 crumpled dollars at sunset, I felt rich. That night, I opened the journal and wrote, "Today, I earned my bread." From there, it became a pattern. Some days I found work, some days I didn't. But every time I did, I proved to myself that I still had value. That journal started filling with entries about carrying bricks, digging trenches, mixing cement. Each page was a record of survival. And then, one day, a fellow laborer named Miguel pulled me aside during lunch break. He handed me half his sandwich and said, "Man, you work like someone chasing his soul back." Those words hit me like lightning. Chasing my soul back, that was exactly what I was doing. I wasn't just earning dollars. I was clawing back pieces of the man I used to be. I began saving whatever I could. Coins at first, then bills tucked into my shoe. Eventually, I scraped together enough to rent a tiny room in a rundown boarding house. It wasn't much, a mattress on the floor, one small window, but it wasn't a park bench. Every step forward went into the journal. The first night I slept in that room, I wrote, "This is the first door I've closed behind me in years." That notebook held my failures, yes, but it also began to hold my victories. And as I turned page after page, I saw a man emerging. Not the polished business owner I once was, not the man my family had abandoned, but someone new, someone tougher, hungrier, unwilling to give up. The turning point wasn't dramatic. No one swooped in to rescue me. No miracle check arrived in the mail. It was a notebook from the trash, a decision to keep moving, and the belief that even if the world had erased me, I could still write myself back into existence. And so, brick by brick, entry by entry, I began to rebuild. Not just my life, but my soul. I had rebuilt my life brick by brick, but the scars never left me. Even after I owned a small crew again, even after I rented my own place, even after I started attending Sunday dinners with neighbors who had once ignored me, those scars still ached. They were stitched into me like old wounds that throb when the weather changes. That's why, when my grandson Ethan did something extraordinary, my heart swelled and shattered at the same time. Ethan was 12 years old, wide-eyed and brimming with energy. He loved books the way his father, David, once did. But where David had grown quiet and withdrawn as a teenager, Ethan was different. Fearless with his words. He wrote stories about knights and heroes, about men who faced impossible odds and stood tall anyway. And one day, he told me he was working on something big. Months later, I got the call. "Grandpa," Ethan's voice beamed through the line. "My book is finished. It's called My Hero is My Grandfather." I nearly dropped the phone. I asked him, stunned, "Ethan, are you serious? Your hero is me?" "Of course," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You're the strongest person I know." My chest tightened. I sat there in silence, torn between pride and guilt. He only knew the man I'd become, the steady grandfather who taught him how to hold a hammer, who read his drafts late at night, who never missed a chance to encourage him. He didn't know the man who once slept under bridges, who had been abandoned by everyone he loved, who had almost given up. The book launch was set for the community center. The whole family would be there, my son David, my ex-wife Linda, even my brother Mark. I was invited, of course. Ethan begged me to come, but the thought of walking into that room, seeing the same faces that had turned away from me in my darkest hour, smiling like nothing had ever happened, I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit in a chair while they applauded me, while they clapped for the myth of Samuel Grant the hero. Because the truth was, my story wasn't neat. It was jagged, ugly, painful. The night before the launch, I sat at my desk staring at the journal, the same battered notebook I'd pulled from the trash decades earlier. Its pages were yellowed now, the ink faded, but every word still screamed with the voice of a man clawing his way back from the edge. I picked it up, held it in my hands, and whispered to myself, "This is who I really am." The next morning, instead of putting on a suit for the launch, I wrapped the journal carefully in brown paper. On the first page, I wrote a note to Ethan. "Inside this book is the man behind your hero. One day, when you're ready, read it. Know that strength is not about never falling. It's about rising again when the world forgets you exist. This is my truth, and now it's yours." I mailed it to him that very day. Later that evening, while the family gathered at the community center, while Ethan stood at the podium holding his book proudly, I sat alone in my kitchen. I poured myself a cup of coffee, opened the window, and listened to the sounds of the neighborhood. I imagined his voice reading passages, the room filled with applause, and for once I didn't feel bitterness, I felt peace, because I knew Ethan would soon hold my real story in his hands, not the polished version, not the hero worship, the truth. And truth, I realized, is the greatest gift you can give someone you love. That journal wasn't just paper and ink, it was the map of my survival, the record of every small victory, every crushing defeat, every promise I wrote to myself in the dark. By sending it to Ethan, I wasn't just giving him history, I was giving him a lantern for the nights he would someday face his own shadows. So, while the family celebrated a version of me they thought they understood, I celebrated quietly, knowing my grandson would learn the deeper story. And when he did, he wouldn't just see a hero. He'd see a man who fell, broke, bled, and still found a way to rise. The package reached Ethan a few days after his launch. I imagined him tearing into it, expecting some kind of congratulatory gift from his grandfather, maybe a pen, maybe a keepsake. Instead, he found a worn journal, pages frayed at the edges, words cramped and uneven. My truth, raw and unedited. For 2 days, I didn't hear from him, not a word. I wondered if I had made a mistake. Maybe he'd see me differently. Maybe his bright image of me as a hero would crumble into pity or disappointment. But then, on the third evening, my phone rang. "Grandpa?" Ethan's voice was softer than usual, hesitant. "Yeah, Ethan. Did you get it?" He paused, and I could hear his breathing, thick with emotion. I read it, all of it. My heart clenched. I braced myself. "Grandpa," he said finally, his voice breaking, "you're even more of a hero than I thought. Not because you were strong all the time, but because you weren't. Because you fell, and you still got back up. I didn't know it was that bad. I didn't know they left you like that. I sat at my kitchen table, gripping the phone so tight my knuckles whitened. Tears welled in my eyes. For decades I'd carried that pain in silence, believing no one in my family would ever understand. But here was my grandson, not only understanding, but honoring it. "Thank you," I whispered. "That means more than you'll ever know." In that moment, the weight of 35 years seemed to ease just a little. A week later, Ethan came over. He didn't come alone. My son, David, stood on the porch with him. For the first time in decades, David's eyes didn't look through me. They looked at me. When he stepped inside, he cleared his throat. "Dad, I read parts of the journal too. Ethan showed me." I froze. Shame flushed my face. "David, He cut me off, his voice low. "I didn't know. I was a kid, but I remember how I looked at you back then. I thought you gave up on us. I didn't realize you were fighting just to stay alive." For a long moment we stood in silence, two men staring at the years that had stolen so much from us. Then, slowly, David put his hand on my shoulder. It wasn't forgiveness in full, not yet, but it was a start. And that's when I understood something. Sometimes healing doesn't come in grand gestures. Sometimes it starts with a cracked open door, a hand on your shoulder, or a grandson saying, "You're my hero because you survived." The rest of the family hasn't changed overnight. My mother, Helen, passed away years ago, never knowing this version of me. My brother Mark still lives in his world of suits and numbers, too proud to revisit the past. And Linda, well, she and I have our own distance. One. That time may never erase. But I no longer ache for their approval. I no longer crave their acknowledgement, because Ethan saw me, really saw me. And through him, David has begun to see me too. That's the gift of legacy, not the wealth you leave behind, not the houses you build, not the name carved in stone. Legacy is the story you hand to the next generation, the map of where you stumbled, how you crawled, and why you stood up again. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to this story to take away, it's this: strength isn't perfection. Strength isn't the clean, polished image you show to the world. Strength is surviving the days when you're invisible, when even your family doesn't believe in you, and still choosing to rise. I once believed my life ended when I lost my business, my home, my family's respect. But looking back now, I see that was the beginning. Because from that wreckage, I built something stronger, not just a life, but a legacy. Today, when Ethan calls me his hero, I smile. Not because I see myself as one, but because he sees the scars and still calls me worthy. That's more powerful than applause at a book launch. That's more healing than any speech I could have given on stage. The truth is, every person will face a moment when the world forgets them, when they feel erased. And in that moment you have two choices. Let the silence consume you, or write your voice back into existence. I chose to write, I chose to fight, I chose to build again, and because of that, my grandson now carries not just my name but my story. And that, more than any business I could have built, is my true legacy. So that's my story. A story about losing everything, being forgotten by the people I loved most, and slowly clawing my way back until I could hand my grandson not just a life rebuilt, but a legacy worth carrying forward. If you take anything from this, let it be this: no matter how far you fall, no matter how deep the silence gets, your story isn't over until you decide it's over. Sometimes the world will forget you. Sometimes even your own family will erase you. But if you hold on, if you fight, if you keep building brick by brick, one day someone you love will look at you and see not the failures, but the fighter who refused to stay down. That's what Ethan gave me when he called me his hero. Not because I was perfect, but because I was real. And I hope, wherever you are in your own journey, you remember that your scars don't make you less. They make you unforgettable. If this story moved you, If it made you think of your own struggles or someone in your life who deserves to be honored, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you found value in this video, please take a moment to like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep telling stories that matter. Your support helps bring more voices, more struggles, and more triumphs into the light. Thank you for listening. Until next time, keep building, one brick at a time.